Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ma'am Shella. Good morning, classmates. I am Jessilyn A. Nepomuceno, and my report for this morning is all about narrative writing. So, telling stories is an ancient art that started long before humans invented writing. So, people tell stories when they gossip, tell jokes, or reminisce about the past. So, written forms of narration include most of writing, like personal essays, fairy tales, short stories, novels, plays, screenplays, autobiographies, histories, or even news stories have a narrative. So, narratives may be a sequence of events in chronological order or in an imagined tale with a flashback or multiple timelines. Now, what is a narrative writing? So, narrative writing is essentially story writing. A narrative can be fiction or non-fiction, and it can also occupy the space between this as a semi-autobiographical story, historical fiction, or dramatized telling of actual events. So there are elements in a narrative. So every narrative has five elements that define its narrative. So these elements are rarely stated in a story. They are revealed to the readers in a story in a subtitle or not so subtitles ways. But the writer needs to understand the elements to assemble her story. So the basic five elements that can be found in a narrative are characters, setting, plot, conflict, and theme. Now let us discuss the first element in a narrative. The first one is the characters. So characters are the people involved in the narrative. So the process by which a writer creates a character is called characterization. So there are two characters in a narrative. The first one is the protagonist. So the protagonist is the main or central character. It is often considered the hero. Then the other character is the antagonist. It is the main character who opposes the protagonist. Sometimes it is called villain. So the next element in the narrative is the setting. So this element can refer to a time and place the story is set in. So the location can either work symbolically or can simply be a backdrop for the story to take place in. If you're going to write your own narrative, you are going to consider the time and the place. Next. Okay, now so let's move on to the next element, which is the plot. So plot is the structure of narrative that moves through time. So most narratives, but not all, follow this traditional plot structure. So there is a plot structure we need to follow. So the first one is the exposition. So exposition is the introduction of setting and characters. In this exposition, you are going to introduce your characters and the place or time of your narrative. So next one is rising action. So the events that build conflict for the protagonist. So next is climax. So climax is the tension of conflict reaches highest or most intense point. Then the falling action is the events following the climax. And the last one, the last structure is the denouement. So the denouement is the resolution of conflict. So the next element is the conflict. So conflict refers to the issue or problem characters story are confronted by. So the narrative is structured around how the character face the conflict or his or her problem. So there are four general types of conflicts. The first one is person versus person. For example, a couple going through a divorce. So that is the conflict or the problem in the narrative, or the person versus person conflict. The next one is person versus self. For example, the protagonist wrestling with depression. For example, that protagonist or that character is going through depression. So it is an example of person versus self conflict. So the third one is person versus nature. So the protagonist trying to survive a natural disaster. Then the last one is the person versus society. So, for example, the protagonist is fighting for civil rights. So that is the example of person versus society. So the next element is the theme. So theme is perhaps the most important literary concept because it is the overarching idea that the writer of the story wants the reader to understand. So if you are going to write a narrative, you must um, have a theme so that the reader can understand what is your narrative or what is the story is all about. So the theme is the author's commentary on a subject. Okay, in a narrative writing, there are different types. So let us now discuss the types of narrative writing. So there are four types. The first one is linear narrative. The second one is nonlinear narrative. The third one is viewpoint narrative. And the last one is the descriptive narrative. Let us discuss it one by one. So now let us discuss the first type of narrative, the linear narrative. With a linear narrative, a story's events are told in chronological order. So most books, movies, TV shows, and other pieces of media are linear narratives. With a linear narrative, each scene is followed by the next logical scene. So this kind of this type of narrative, it is live up to their name, meaning so you can draw straight line from the beginning until the end of the story. So this narrative start from the beginning and then tell the consecutive events until the finale of your story. So this is what you call the linear narrative. Okay, the second type of narrative is the non-linear narrative. In contrast to a linear narrative, a non-linear narrative presents each story's events in non-chronological order. So by choosing a non-linear narrative for your writing, you can emphasize your character's emotions and perspectives on the events in the story. So in contrast, of the linear narrative, non-linear narratives might skip around to different points in time. So if you're going to talk about non-linear narrative in a storytelling or in a narrative writing, the device that portrays events of story out of chronological order. For example, in reverse order or going back and forth between past and future events. Okay, the next type of narrative is the viewpoint narrative. A viewpoint narrative focuses on the narrator's perspective of the story's events. So generally, this kind of stories are more character driven than plot driven. So narrative viewpoints, also known as perspectives, so it is determine who is narrating the plot or events of a story. So writers of fiction and non-fiction alike can use different narrative viewpoints to control how readers receive their work. Okay, the last type of a narrative is the descriptive narrative. In a descriptive narrative, the focus is on how the story setting, characters, and objects look and feel. In a descriptive narrative, it connects imagery, ideas, and details to convey a sense of time and place. So the purpose of descriptive narrative is to create a sense of setting of time and place. Then to convey the mood and tone of the set time and place. For example, the place or the setting of your narrative writing is peaceful, threatening, cheerful, or chaotic. So that is the descriptive narrative. Again, there are four types of narrative. The first one is the linear narrative. The next one is the non-linear narrative, viewpoint narrative, and the last one is the descriptive narrative. So why is it important that my pupils learns narrative writing? So there are lots of reasons why it's important for the learners to learn narrative writing. So among them are to stimulate their imagination and to foster their artistic expression. So through narrative writing, it allows students to express their stories creatively. So it also helps the students clarify their thinking and teach them to express that in writing in organized way. It also helps them to search for identity. So through narrative writing, it helps them to explore different characters and settings. With the help of the basic elements and the different types of narrative, the pupils are able to write or to create their own narrative or story. It is important for the students or for the pupils to write their own narrative so that it can enhance or it can their critical thinking will be developed. So that's all for today, and thank you for listening. This is Jessilyn Nepomuceno, your reporter for this morning.